Picture yourself in a boat on a river, tangerine trees and marmalade skies. Somebody calls you, you answer quite slowly. A girl with kaleidoscope eyes. Cellophane flowers of yellow and green, towering over your head. Look for the girl with the sun in her eyes, and she's gone. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Oh, follow her down to a bridge by a fountain where rocking horse people eat marshmallow pie. Everyone smiles as you drift past the flowers that grow so incredibly high. Newspaper taxis appear on the shore, waiting to take you away. Lying in the back with your head in the clouds and you're gone. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Newspaper taxis appear on the shore, waiting to take you away. Climb in the back with your head in the clouds and you're gone. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Picture yourself on a train in a station with plasticine porters with looking glass ties. Suddenly someone is there at the turnstile, the girl with kaleidoscope eyes. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Oh,
It was the most peaceful, joyous, incredible, life-changing experience I've ever had in my life. There were scary parts, foreboding parts, but I always knew there was beautiful and joy and peace on the other side of it. It was freeing. It was really freeing.
This is Alana.
Welcome,
She's
Deb.
describing what she felt after she took a
Welcome,
dose
guys.
of this stuff, psilocybin. It's a naturally occurring psychedelic compound, the kind that you find in magic mushrooms. But she wasn't tripping in a dorm room or a Woodstock. It actually wasn't recreational at all.
If anything became unreal or I was feeling nervous or not in touch with reality, I would squeeze his hand and he would squeeze mine back just to reassure me that I was okay and everything was all right.
It was part of a controlled medical test to see if psychedelics could be useful in helping people quit cigarettes. Alana had been smoking for 37 years before her session with psilocybin, and she hasn't had a cigarette since. Research on psychedelics for medical use is preliminary. Most studies suffer from really small sample sizes, and that's partly because the federal government lists LSD and psilocybin as Schedule I drugs. So researchers face extra red tape, and funding is really hard to come by. Vox writer Herman Lopez reviewed dozens of studies that have been done, and he found that psychedelics show promise for treating addiction, OCD, anxiety, and in some cases, depression. One small study of 15 smokers found that 80% were able to abstain from smoking for 6 months after a psilocybin treatment. In a pilot study of 12 advanced cancer patients suffering from end-of-life anxiety, participants who took psilocybin generally showed lower scores on a test of depression. And a smaller study suggested that psilocybin treatment could actually help people with alcohol dependence cut back on their drinking days. We don't have all the answers as to what exactly these treatments are doing in the brain, but they seem to work by providing a meaningful and even mystical experience that leads to lasting changes in a patient's life.
The issues that I talked about or thought about or went into during my experience were transformative in the sense that I got to look at them through a different lens.
I know it sounds weird. I feel like I have more connections in my brain that I couldn't access before.
That feeling that Alana is describing is actually pretty spot on. When you take LSD, your brain looks something like this. You can actually see a higher degree of connectivity between various parts of the brain. It's not limited to the visual cortex. This communication inside the brain helps explain visual hallucinations, and the researchers argue that it could also explain why psychedelics can help people overcome serious mental issues. They wrote that you can think of psychiatric disorders as the brain being entrenched in pathology. Harmful patterns become automated and hard to change, and that's what can make things like anxiety and addiction and depression very hard to treat.
The reason that those kinds of conditions are so difficult to treat is that there's something more to them than just the illness.
That's Albert Garcia Romu. He's a Johns Hopkins researcher who's worked on studies of psilocybin and smoking addiction, like the one that Alana's involved with. He says that when participants take psychedelics,
they have very profound, meaningful experiences that can sometimes help them to make new insights into their own behaviors, and also to kind of reconnect with their values and priorities in terms of what's very important to them.
One of the big remaining questions here is how long these benefits actually last after the one-time treatment. A review of research on LSD-assisted psychotherapy and alcoholism found no statistically significant benefits after 12 months. And a recent study on psilocybin and depression found that benefits significantly dropped off after just 3 months. And of course, there are some big risks to using psychedelic drugs. It's hard to predict a patient's reaction, and some might actually endanger themselves. Those predisposed to psychotic conditions are especially at risk for having a traumatic experience while on the drug. It's difficult to draw solid conclusions from the existing studies, but there's more than enough promise here to merit further research and further funding for that research. As Matthew Johnson of Johns Hopkins said, these are among the most debilitating and costly disorders known to humankind. For some people, no existing treatments help, but psychedelics might. One thing you might still be wondering is why so much of this research is so new when we've known about psychedelics for thousands of years. Well, since these drugs are so old, they can't be patented, which means that pharmaceutical companies don't really have any incentive to fund any research into them. So that really leaves it up to governments and private contributors to fund all these studies. And there actually was a lot of research done into these drugs in the 50s and 60s, but there was a big enough backlash to the abuse of psychedelics in that period, especially around events like Woodstock, that funding really dried up. and research stopped. And that's why it's only now that we see this research happening with private and not government contributions.
An ordinary hospital in West London. In an ordinary hospital room, something very out of the ordinary is happening. Step by step, it's being transformed into a psychedelic lounge. Over the last 12 months, patients with severe drug-resistant depression have been brought into this room and given a strong and illegal hallucinogenic, psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. In charge of this radical new drug trial is scientist Robin Carhart-Harris. So the room has been transformed from a bog standard hospital room into something a bit more cozy. Why do you do this?
We're trying to provide a setting that is supportive, that's warm, that's nurturing, where the patient can feel safe and supported and free and able to open up, really.
This is one of a number of recent trials reviving some of the most controversial psychiatric research of the 1950s and 60s.
After receiving a small dose of LSD, they're confused and undisciplined.
Around 40,000 patients worldwide were treated with psychedelics for everything from alcoholism to schizophrenia. That all stopped when governments around the world began to ban recreational drugs. Half a century later, and doctors are tentatively picking up this research, with around a dozen trials now worldwide beginning to explore medical uses of psychedelics. Andrew Thayer was one of 20 patients on the trial. He's struggled with depression for 2 decades.
It's hard to describe it, the hopelessness that you feel when you're depressed. I got to a point last November where I'd pretty much given up. I thought, I just can't do this anymore.
He found out about the trial online and applied. To his surprise, he was accepted. That's how, 3 months ago, he found himself in a hospital room in West London, being given a Class A psychedelic drug.
And the environment, it's completely as you want it. So if at any point you just decide that you don't want the music, that's fine, we'll turn it off, or, it's whatever you feel is comfortable.
Ros Watts is a clinical psychologist who helped guide patients through the experience.
I was surprised at the level of his suffering, because when we met him, he was such a charming, kind of so sensitive as well to other people's needs and so great at conversation that it was difficult to see the suffering at first. But we did see it in the dosing days that we realised how much he'd been struggling against.
How are you feeling? It's been half an hour.
Okay, it's something that Yeah, it started out not nice. It felt as though something was in my chest. It started off fairly pleasantly, but it soon got pretty dark. I think I described it as a black tide coming in.
Often with psychedelics, emotions and difficult experiences that have been repressed because they're so uncomfortable and painful come to the surface. And that can be very healthy and very positive in terms of change, because avoidance of difficult emotion is really at the heart of many mental health difficulties.
Try having a look, opening your eyes very gradually, and try just looking at the rose.
I was still feeling a wee bit woozy. Ros said, just concentrate on this rose, and she picked up a rose from the vase. This rose had taken on a life of its own, and was definitely trying to communicate that everything's fine, everything's beautiful.
It's worth saying that patients had a variety of different experiences, and Andy's was darker than most. It was unclear at the time what long-term effects these trips would have. Today, scientists published their results in The Lancet.
So these are the results from the study so far, 20 patients now. This is a measure of the severity of patients' depression. You can see 1 week post-treatment, you can see that virtually every patient shows some decrease in their depressive symptoms.
But the results do look much more mixed once you get past 1 week. When you go back to the 3 months, there are sort of patients that are kind of not doing quite
That's
so
right.
well.
And so we are seeing signs of relapse in some of the patients. That's quite common in depression, particularly treatment-resistant depression. It tells us really that this isn't a magic cure. Even so, if we were to take average scores, even up to 3 months and 6 months post-treatment, there's really quite a highly significant decrease in depressive symptoms at those time points.
The researchers believe that psilocybin increases the connectivity of parts of the brain. It's speculated that in depression, the brain gets stuck into repetitive negative patterns of thinking.
So if we can introduce a kind of flexibility into the mind and into the brain, then perhaps that could help us shift an individual out of that rut that they've become stuck in.
The problem is, at this stage, this is only a theory, and the study itself is not without its difficulties. There is an ethical issue here, isn't there, of taking people who are very severely depressed, taking them off antidepressants, giving them a Class A drug, and then not giving them the therapy that they might need afterwards.
If they decide to come off their medication, then that's something that we do with close monitoring. We stay in contact with their mental health practitioner or GP. And I think people should consider that if ever they think, I want to go out and find some magic mushrooms and I have to come off my antidepressant medication. I think to do that is quite dangerous. And in the context of this trial, the way we did it was with some very careful monitoring.
3 months after Andy's trial, and he's still coming to terms with what he went through.
I think what I'm experiencing are aftershocks, because even now, I'll have good days and bad days, but some of the good days are outnumbering the bad days. And I'm off antidepressants, and I wouldn't have thought that was possible. On the whole, I think it's moved me into a different direction. It's kicked me out of the rut, as it were.
Andy believes psilocybin has benefited him, but the trial by clinical standards is tiny, and the researchers admit that much more evidence is needed before they can be sure of what the effects of the drug are. Another larger trial is planned, but this kind of research takes time. It's unlikely then that your local GP will be able to prescribe psilocybin anytime soon.
LSD does cause psychosis in the people who don't take it. So said Timothy Leary at the height of the 60s, after acid had escaped from medical labs and gone wild in the streets. It was as though the counterculture had moved from Kansas to Oz. By 1966, LSD was illegal, tragically shutting down and stigmatizing highly promising medical experiments for decades to come. The experiments ranged from the sublime to the ridiculous. LSD showed such promise in treating alcoholism that Alcoholics Anonymous founder Bill Wilson considered including it in his program. In Britain, the military gave it to soldiers. 50 minutes after taking the drug, radio communication had become impossible, with one soldier climbing a tree to feed the birds. The troop commander finally gave up, admitting he could no longer control his troops or himself, whereupon he lapsed into uncontrollable laughter. So much for military use. Leading medical researcher Stanislav Grof, who worked with LSD while it was legal in the 50s and 60s in Prague and in Maryland at the US National Institute of Mental Health, says this: "The cartography that emerged out of this work was a vast expansion beyond what we currently have in psychiatry and psychology. You can map different layers of the psyche, a kind of chemical archaeology. It opened up a vast domain that we now call transpersonal experiences. The other major discovery was the self-healing potential of the psyche. When you change consciousness, it activates your self-healing potential. The fact that we have such narrow and superficial psychiatry means that we diagnose as psychotic certain states which potentially could be transformative, healing, even evolutionary. Today, the popular use of psychedelics is as big as it was in the heyday of the 60s. And over the past decade plus, there's been a quiet renaissance of serious medical research. Michael Pollan calls it white coat shamanism. In his new bestseller, How to Change Your Mind, he documents how psychedelics are helping with everything from overcoming addiction and depression to easing the existential terror of the terminally ill. There couldn't be a more perfect messenger to bring this taboo subject into the light. Michael is level-headed and lucid, a rigorous reporter, a congenital skeptic, a superb translator of science into comprehensible language, and a spellbinding storyteller. But what makes him letter perfect for this mission improbable is that his brand is immersive journalism. In other words, he samples his subject. In doing so, he makes the ineffable effable. As one medical researcher told him, you go deep enough and far enough in consciousness, and you will bump into the sacred. In his many groundbreaking and highly influential books and articles, Michael has almost single-handedly shifted the national conversation on issues central to human existence: our relationship to food with the omnivore's dilemma, and to cultivar plants with the botany of desire. Now he's done it again. How to Change Your Mind is the authoritative, up-to-date analysis of everything science has learned and all the mysteries yet to be explored. If anyone can open people's minds to this uniquely impressive curative abilities that these substances have demonstrated, it's Michael. Human consciousness is one of the greatest mysteries of existence. As Tom Bissell wrote in the New York Times Book Review, Pollan predictably does the impossible. He makes losing your mind sound like the sanest thing a person could do. Please join me in welcoming the white rabbit of immersive journalism, who's losing his mind and proud of it, Michael Pollan.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, and thank you, Kenny, for that hilarious introduction. Before I start, I just want to say a word about Bioneers. This is either my 4th or 5th time on this stage, and the reason I'm here, one of the reasons I'm here, is to express my gratitude to Kenny and Nina for all that this community has contributed to my work. I was going through the list with Kenny about people I met or saw on this stage that became very influential in my own work. It was through Kenny I met Joel Salatin, the farmer who's at the center of Omnivore's Dilemma. It was through Bioneers that I was first exposed to Paul Stamets, the mycologist, the visionary mycologist, who's very much a part of this book. Heritage Seeds was an idea that Kenny introduced me to when he was working on that. So I just, time after time, there has been key moments, and I have this sense my next book is like somebody out here. I just have to find them. So this is I'm doing a very personal talk right now, and it's a talk I haven't done before. So I have to tell you a few things about myself to make sense of it, but I also have to ask a few things of you. So let's begin. Would you close your eyes and raise your hand if you've had a psychedelic experience? Whoa. And then raise your hand if you had a ego-dissolving, self-destroying kind of psychedelic experience. Oh, man. Okay, well, many of you could be on this stage with me. Many of you have much more experience than I do. The things I want to tell you about myself in starting is that I was a very reluctant psychonaut. I had very little experience. I kind of got into it when I was about to turn 60, which is, I know, not age appropriate. And the reasons for that were that I was afraid. I was a little late to the 60s party, and by the time it kind of swam into my awareness, all you heard were terrifying stories about people jumping out of windows and staring at the sun till they went blind and scrambled your chromosomes, and all that kept me away. And I just didn't think. I also thought I was psychologically too fragile. I think that this assault on my psyche I might not be able to withstand. So I kind of, with the exception of a couple low dose psilocybin experiments in my late 20s, I really had nothing to do with it. So I bring not a long history, but the power of first sight to this subject. The other thing you need to know about me is that I never thought of myself as a very spiritual person. In fact, I thought of myself as kind of spiritually retarded. And the most spiritual thing I did really was come to Bioneers once a year. And I always felt a little bit a fish out of water. My perspective has always been that of the philosophical materialist who believes that nature is all that there is and that the laws of nature can explain everything. And so I tended to see spirituality as a contradiction, that the opposite of spiritual was material, and I was kind of more on the material side of things. Now, as I'll get to, this was fundamentally a misunderstanding, but I want to tell you how I came to have what I realize now is a powerful spiritual experience on psychedelics, and how that experience changed my understanding of what spiritual is. So I got into psychedelics as a journalist. It was a journalistic quest that gradually evolved, actually very quickly evolved, into a spiritual quest, into a personal quest. And that was, I'd read about these studies that Kenny alluded to of terminal cancer patients being given psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. I usually have to say that. I don't have to say that in this room. But just in case, there's some young people here, to help them with their existential terror. Now, to me, when I first heard about it, this seemed like a really bad idea. The last thing I would want if I was facing right up against my mortality was to lose my mind. So this was going on. This is not underground work. This was going on at NYU and at Johns Hopkins, two of the leading medical institutions in the country. So I got an assignment to write about it for the New Yorker, and it resulted in a piece called "The Trip Treatment," which you can read online. And I started interviewing.
Night, Jay. Sweet dreams, lad.
The background to this story, which I didn't realize till much later, was that my father had a terminal cancer diagnosis around the same time. He just died in January. And he was in his late 80s, and he never wanted to talk about it. He never wanted to talk about how was he thinking about death? How was he processing this cataclysm? And either he was processing it internally or he was in denial. I never sort of figured it out. So I had this intense curiosity to engage in these conversations with people who were confronting their mortality and were trying to deal with it. And they were the most amazing people and the most amazing conversations. People would have experiences in which they went into their body and confronted their cancer, in which they met God. These are high dose experiences in which they felt themselves, their sense of self completely dissolve, and followed by emerging into some larger entity. Some of them, I remember, beheld this great plane of consciousness that they understood their own consciousness would join when their bodies died. And they emerged from these experiences, about 2/3 of them, all the ones who had powerful mystical experiences, with a completely new understanding of where they were and what was happening to them. Many of them lost their fear of dying. It was the most incredible thing and very hard for me to understand from outside. I remember there was one woman I interviewed who had ovarian cancer. It was in remission, but she still had this terror of recurrence. This is a woman in her early 60s and a fairly timid woman, figure skating instructor in Manhattan. And she went into her body on her experience, and she saw this black mass underneath her rib cage. And she realized that wasn't her cancer because it was in the wrong place. It was her fear. And she did something that her guides, now when you do one of these guided experiences, there are two people with you, a man and a woman the whole time. You're wearing eye shades and listening to music, a playlist on headphones. And all of a sudden she screams at the black mass, although they don't know this, "Get the fuck out of my body." And with that, her fear just poof, disappeared. And I wrote in the article, in the draft, that, and her fear was, substantially diminished, something safe that would get past the New Yorker fact checkers. But when they called her to read this, and they said, well, is it true that your fear was substantially diminished, fear of death? She said, no, he got that wrong. That's completely wrong. My fear was eliminated. So these stories made me intensely curious to understand what this experience was from the inside. I wrote that article not thinking I would ever try psilocybin or have a high dose experience, but I decided I now had to. For that reason, curiosity, but also it is, as Kenny said, it's the kind of journalism I do. When I wrote about the cattle industry, I bought a cow. And so my readers expect no less. But I have to say, I was terrified. I had a sleepless night before. I had several guided experiences on several, and unguided experiences on several different medicines. And every night there would be this ping pong match of, are you crazy? You could have a heart attack. You're going to go to the middle of nowhere with this guy, and is he going to call 911 if something happens? And then this other voice was like, aren't you really curious to know what would happen? And I realized the first voice was my ego defending itself because it knew what was coming, an assault on it. And the problem with your ego is it has command of your rational faculties. So it makes really good arguments that are hard to ignore. But in every case, I was able to ignore it. But you have to realize too, when you start late, I had to call my cardiologist before I did this. When you're 60, so he was cool with everything except MDMA. And he may have been wrong about that, I don't know. So I want to tell you about two of the experiences I had. One briefly, and I'm bringing up this one because it really connects to what Monica was talking about earlier, which was, as many of you know, I've written a lot about plants, and it's really my first love as a writer and as a gardener. And I've always, in Botany of Desire, I talked about the fact that we're not the only subject in nature, that the plants have a point of view too. The subtitle of that book was A Plant's Eye View of the World. But this was an intellectual conceit until I used psychedelics. So I had without a guide, I had a fairly high dose experience in my garden. And I had a very strong sense of the plant, that consciousness was spread more equally over the natural world than I had ever thought before. And that as I was gazing at these leaves were gazing back at me with incredible benign, affect. But that everything was much more alive than it had ever been. And so what had been this intellectual conceit became this felt truth, this conviction. And I think that's one of the things psychedelics do, is that they put flesh on ideas. Ideas I'd already had. So I want to read you a brief passage. It's the only thing I'm going to read for reasons of time, from what it was like to walk through my garden toward the end of this experience, and picture a summer day in New England, very hot summer day with lots of things flitting around. My walk back to the house was, I think, the peak of the experience, and comes back to me now in the colors and tones of a dream. There was again the sense of pushing my body through a mass of air that had been sweetened by phlox and was teeming, almost frenetic with activity. The dragonflies, big as birds, were now out in force, touching down just long enough to kiss the phlox blossoms and then lift off before madly crisscrossing the garden path. There were more dragonflies than I had ever seen in one place, so many, in fact, that I wasn't completely sure if they were real. Judith, my wife, later confirmed the sighting when I got her to come outside. And as they executed their flight patterns, they left behind them contrails that persisted in the air, or so at least it appeared. Dusk now approaching, the air traffic in the garden had built to a riotous crescendo. The pollinators making their last rounds of the day, the plants still signifying to them with their flowers, me, me, me. In one way, I knew this scene well, the garden coming briefly to life after the heat of a summer day had relented, but never had I felt so integral to it. I was no longer the alienated human observer, gazing at the garden from a distance, whether literal or figural, but rather felt part and parcel of all that was transpiring here. So the flowers were addressing me as much as the pollinators, and perhaps because the very air that afternoon was such a felt presence, it was so humid, one's usual sense of oneself as a subject observing objects in space, objects that have been thrown into relief and rendered discrete by the apparent void that surrounds them, gave way to a sense of being deep inside and fully implicated in the scene. One more being in relation to the myriad other beings and to the whole. Everything is interaction and reciprocal, wrote Alexander von Humboldt, the great 18th century naturalist. And that felt very much the case. And so for the first time, did this, that he also said, I myself am identical with nature. So that was, thank you. That was a very profound experience, and I would describe that as spiritual. And I'll tell you what I mean after I give you this experience, this other one, where I, thus emboldened, I went further and much deeper. So I arranged to have a high dose, kind of matching the doses in these NYU and Hopkins studies, 25 milligrams of psilocybin, although I had mushrooms and not the chemical, which has been isolated. I was working with a guide somewhere on the East Coast, very experienced, a woman who was a wonderful guide, and I felt very safe in her space. And that is critically important if you're willing to have your ego dissolve. You do need to feel safe. And the trip didn't start out that well. I'm going to just walk you through this trip and then tell you what I think it means. She put on some, I had a problem with some of the underground guides. This was not this was obviously an underground illegal experience, not I couldn't get into the trials at Hopkins or NYU because I didn't have a cancer diagnosis or any of the other diagnoses they were working with. But some of the underground guides play music that I didn't really like. They have a weakness for new age music of the 80s variety. And she put on this guy named, well, I'm not going to give his name. I don't want to embarrass him. But when I looked him up later on iTunes, he had been thrice nominated in the category of Best Chill/Groove music. And it sounded like electronica to me, and it conjured, one of the things that happens on psychedelics is you can see music. And what I saw was a computer-generated black and white landscape that was not my thing. I don't like video games. It's not the space I wanted to be in. I wanted natural imagery, and it went on and on and on, and I started to feel kind of claustrophobic. And we argued about the music, and I had her change it, but I was stuck in computer world. And finally, I had to pee, and I took off the eye shades. And what the amazing thing is, you can kind of like come back into reality when you need to for a little while. And she kind of helped me get to the bathroom, and I was very careful not to look in the mirror. You don't want to do that. I said this to an audience in England of very experienced people, and they were like, oh yes, trip face. So I didn't do that. And I produced this spectacular crop of diamonds and then made my way back to the futon where I was. And Mary asked me if I wanted a little more. a booster dose. And I was in for the whole thing, so I said yes. And then this really weird thing happens, and she's kneeling by my side. I'm in this futon, and I look at her, and she's normally kind of Scandinavian looking with long blonde hair and high cheekbones, and she suddenly had black hair and weathered brown skin, and I knew exactly who she had turned into, Maria Sabina, who some of you will know is was the Mazatec woman from Huautla de Jimenez in Mexico, who actually gave the first white man from the West psilocybin in the 1950s. So a key figure in the history of psychedelics. And she had turned, and I didn't think I should tell Mary what had happened to her. So I took the additional dose and I put on the eye shades again, and then the most spooky thing happened. I'm out of computer world now, and I suddenly, and the pronouns are going to sound weird, I see myself burst into just this cloud of little Post-it notes. I'd been blasted to bits, but I was watching the scene. There was another perspective that had opened up, and I watched, and then I looked out, and I'd been liquefied. I had turned into paint or butter, just kind of coating the landscape. But I was fine with it. This other I had emerged, was like, that's what happens, you turn into paint. And it was the most amazing thing. I didn't have a self, but this other perspective had arisen that had this perfect equanimity. Whatever happened is fine. It wasn't exactly me, and I don't know what it was. Aldous Huxley would say it was the mind at large. It was some kind of universal consciousness. But I realized it was precisely the consciousness that those cancer patients had described to me. The one that made the death of their bodily selves and their egos bearable. And when that happens, when your self falls apart, if you feel safe, because if you fight this, that's a bad trip. If you feel safe, without the walls of the ego and the self, these channels open up. And you feel this powerful sense. What rushes in is your sense of connection. Because there's nothing you have no defenses anymore. You are wide open. And so you merge, whether it's with nature or other people. And you feel these channels of love opening up, and this sense of fellow feeling with natural things. And and for me, there was a moment where I merged with a piece of music that I had persuaded her to put on, this Bach unaccompanied cello concerto, which is an amazing, sad piece. I mean, it's all about death. This is the suite in G minor. And I just became the music. I became the cello. I felt the bow, the friction of the bow going over my skin. It was just this perfect merging. So it was an ecstatic experience. It was, and it taught me a lot. And I think and many people have had this kind of experience, but I want to just give you a sense of what it means and what it's good for. So in one of these guided trips, you come back the next day for an integration session. And I came back and she asked me what had happened. I told her I'd had this ego dissolution. And she's like, well, that's worth the price of admission, don't you think? And I said, yeah, but it's over. I'm back. My ego's back. It's in uniform. It's on patrol. My defenses are all back. And she said, well, you've had a taste of another way to be, of a more open, less defended way to be. And you have that memory, and you can reconnect to it. And I asked her how, and she said through meditation. And that is now how I reconnect to it. I mean, I think it's a very logical outgrowth, because you can't do psychedelics every day. It's really a bad idea. I don't recommend it. But you can have that opening that can help you. Now, I want to say something about the larger value of this experience, because I think that it has a relevance to our situation, our social, political, and environmental situation. I actually think the psychedelic experience is significant because it addresses the two biggest problems we face as a civilization, which I would list as tribalism and the environmental crisis. They're actually very similar. They both involve the objectifying of the other. whether that other is nature or other people, people of different faiths, different races, different political views. And what is tribalism but a collective version of ego, right? It's defensive, it builds walls, it refuses connection. So here we have a tool that, at least for the individual, breaks down these ego formations, allows us to have a deep connection with the natural world and focus on our likeness rather than our unlikeness with other people. That seems enormously promising. But how do you prescribe a drug to a whole culture? Well, put it in the water. The model, of course, is fluoride, right? And even that's controversial. I don't think that's the answer. I don't think that's the answer. And this was a debate that happened in the 60s. Timothy Leary said, turn on as many people as you possibly can. And then Aldous Huxley and some of the academics said, no, turn on the elite, and this consciousness will filter down. Turn on the leadership. Now you're all going to, oh, I can think of someone we should turn on. But I actually don't think that would work. He'd have to want to do it, right? But he knows what his superpower is, and it's ego, it's walls, he's not going to give that up. So that's the challenge that faces us. We have a tool that addresses the two biggest problems we face, and it certainly works well in the individual, and perhaps if more individuals could have this experience, but that is a challenge. How do you democratize this loss of ego, right? Temporary loss of ego for learning purposes. And here's where my understanding of spirituality changed, and I'll leave you with this. Remember I said the opposite of spiritual, I always believed, was material, and that those two things could not be reconciled. I no longer think that's the case. Everything I experienced can be understood without any resort to the supernatural, okay? Connection to other people, connection to nature. Scientists tell us we're social beings. We're totally dependent on one another. And we're completely part and parcel of the natural world. We're no different than any other species. It's just our egos, intent on objectifying things, won't let us see this. So really, I came to understand I had it all wrong about spiritual experience. The opposite of spiritual is egotistical. And to the extent we can work on that, and we need to work on that to have any spiritual development. So I'll leave you with that thought. How do we take that knowledge and democratize it, give it to as many people as possible, and use it to untie this giant knot? So.
This is a critical issue with regards to the shamanic transformation, is that people go through these terrible experiences, often drug-induced, by the way, with regards to the shaman. They usually use psychedelic chemicals of one form or another, often mushrooms, but they've come up with some very strange concoctions like ayahuasca down in the Amazon. And ayahuasca is an amazing substance. It's made out of the bark of one thing and another plant whose name I don't remember, that hardly even grow in the same place and that have to be cooked together in a special way. And no one has any idea how the damn Amazonians figured that out. It looks impossible. And if you ask them, they say, well, the plants told us how to do it, which, you know, Western people don't find very helpful. But the shamans are perfectly happy with that description. And ayahuasca takes them apart. And it does that in part because it affects the serotonergic system very, very powerfully, like all psychedelics do. And it transports them to another world. And that's how they interpret it. And what we know about psychedelics, you could put in a thimble and then throw the thimble away. We know nothing about psychedelics. There's new experiments going on at Johns Hopkins, for example, with psilocybin, which is part of this active chemical in magic mushrooms. Same structure, basically, as LSD and mescaline. And all the real psychedelics have basically the same structure, except the one that's derived from Amanita muscaria, which is called muscarinic acid. And it's its own weird thing that no one knows anything about. Anyways, they have profound neurochemical effects in very small doses. And the research group at Johns Hopkins has given psilocybin to research subjects, purified psilocybin, because they started the new experimentation with psychedelics, and that's been banned for like 40 years, because psychedelics were so terrifying to our culture that we just put them away. It's like, whoa, no, we're not going there. And so even from a research perspective, and even though some of the psychedelics look very promising for the treatment of disorders like alcoholism, they recently used psilocybin to help people stop smoking down at Johns Hopkins, and I think they had an 80% success rate, which is just like, that's just absolutely mind-boggling. And so, but if you give people psilocybin and they have a mystical experience, which is very common among people who take these sorts of chemicals, then their personality transforms permanently, such that 1 year later they're 1 standard deviation higher in openness. And openness is the creativity dimension, and that seems to be a permanent transformation. And so that's really remarkable. And about 80% of the people who undergo the Johns Hopkins experiments report that the experience is like one of the 2 or 3 most important things that's ever happened to them. And so, well, that's something, it's like. And then there's this guy named Rick Strassman down at, I think he was at the University of Texas, and he did experimentation with DMT. And DMT, dimethyltryptamine, if I remember correctly, is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, and you produce it in your brain, and it's in plants. It's like a very common chemical, but DMT is a weird hallucinogen because it has an extraordinarily short mechanism of action. It's like, and people who take it report that they're blasted out of their body, like out of a cannon, and then they go out somewhere and encounter beings of various sorts, and then 10 minutes later they're back. And virtually everyone reports that, which is really strange. And so Strassman was giving people DMT intravenously so that the trip would last longer. This was all NIH funded experimentation, all cleared with the relevant ethics boards, all conducted within the last 10 years. And he basically quit doing it because he was a pretty straight scientist. He was measuring heart rate and pulse and all that sort of thing, trying to look at the physiology. And then the people he was giving these chemicals to kept coming back and telling him these crazy stories. And well, it was too much for him, and no wonder, because they all said the same thing. And he'd say, well, that was a dream. And they'd say, no, and it was the most real thing that ever happened to me. And he'd say, well, it's an archetypal experience. And they'd say, no, that was no archetypal experience. I went somewhere else and I saw things and I'm back, and like, I don't care what you think. And like, who the hell knows, right? Because it's all subjective. But the weird thing about it is that everyone's reporting the same thing. How the hell do you account for that? And then the shaman, when they take these psychedelic chemicals, they basically say the same thing. They say, well, first of all, it more or less killed me. That's this. I dissolved to a skeleton, and then I climbed the tree that unites heaven and earth, and I went into the realm of the gods, and they gave me some information, and I'm back. It's like, okay, well, we don't really know what to make of that. And certainly that's what Eliade describes when he describes the shamanic procession, not the shamanic initiation. And there's dissolution to a skeleton first, and then like a death, the symbolic death, or experienced as an actual death, and then bang, up into the realm of the gods, and then they come back. It's a very old idea. I mean, that's a medieval representation of the tunnel that people travel through at the end of their life to find the light, which is a very common near-death experience report, and people don't have any idea what the hell to do with those reports, except say, well, it's the paroxysms of the dying brain, which you'd expect to be a hell of a lot more random, in my opinion. And the idea is there's a rebirth after that. And here, this is the Scandinavian representation of that tree that unites earth with heaven. And so there's the Scandinavian representation. It has a snakes down here eating it. And then that's the Amazonian representation. It's like, how the hell do you account for that? I mean, those pictures are so similar that it's beyond belief. Well, we lived in trees for a long time. A long, 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 long time. Millions of years. And there were lots of snakes around them. And so the idea that reality is a tree that's surrounded by a snake that's in us, man. It's down there. It's deep. And there's something about it that's true.
Hiya, Babs.
Now, not true like we normally think of truth, but true in an entirely different manner. So And all that's pretty damn strange. We'll stop with this. My son drew this when he was 7 years old. Blew me away, man. I thought it was so cool, so I had it laminated. And so here is what it is. On the right hand side, that's order. It's like the yin yang thing. That's order. Left side, chaos, right? And those are all mushroom houses, which I thought was amazing. And then there's this river that runs right down the middle, like the line for order and chaos. And then there's this tree that goes up to heaven, and that's heaven up there. It's like there's St. Peter, there's the pearly gates, there's the clouds. It's like, he never went to church, you know. It's like, what the hell? And then there's a little bug there that goes up and down from heaven to earth, and that was him. And I thought, he had a very organized psyche, that kid. He was a very, very stable kid, and still is. And he drew that, and I thought, Jesus, that's just bloody well unbelievable. And I still think that when I look at it. And that's a great example of an archetype. And so we'll see you Tuesday.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Well, you know, one of the interesting things about endogenous DMT, and especially with its discovery in such high levels in the brain, is that it may be the endomatrix. It could be kind of regulating everything all of the time.
What do you mean by that? Regulating everything all the time?
It could be the way we interact with reality is through endogenous DMT, which is always at a steady level. Well, it's the way I began wondering about that is because, you know, what is the purpose of endogenous DMT? You know, why does the brain make DMT?
Can you do a DMT test on a person's blood level?
It's pretty hard. It's pretty hard. It's really low in the blood. It's like, you know, billionths of a gram per milliliter.
Okay, so you'd have to measure it in the actual brain itself?
In the brain or spinal fluid, maybe spinal fluid, but most likely brain.
When they start doing stuff like Neuralink, where they're going to insert wires into your brain, and, you know, you're going to have an app to control your brain, to control your mood. I mean, it seems like that would be one of the ways they would do it, right?
Well, you'd need to find, you know, where in the brain the main, you know, source of DMT is, and then put an electrode there and keep that going.
Do you think it's limited to one specific area where it's developed?
Oh man, they're just beginning to unravel the whole role and location of endogenous DMT.
So when they know that it's in the liver and they know that it's in the lungs to me sound interesting because of holotropic breathing.
Right.
You know, because people have done breathing exercises and achieved states of altered states of consciousness.
Yeah.
It kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, but I think it's not working through the lungs because those more recent studies haven't really demonstrated DMT in lung.
Oh.
Yeah. I used to say it's made in lung. Everybody used to say it's made in lung, but it seems like it's made in brain.
So if it's made in brain, then all the other stuff, you're just getting like a trickle down effect?
Well,
does it go through the whole body?
Yeah, but it's metabolized so quickly that, you know, by the time it gets into the blood that you're drawing, the concentrations are pretty minuscule.
Wow. What a sneaky molecule.
Well, you have to wonder what it's doing, right?
Right. What is it doing?
What is endogenous? What's the function of it? You know, there's the possibility we have a DMT neurotransmitter system like serotonin or dopamine, in which case, you know, what is it doing?
Wow. So this is a really wild way to think about it, because to this time, I'd never even considered that. I always thought of it as being something that was responsible maybe for very vivid dreams, or something that was responsible for near-death experiences, or what happens to you when you die, the idea of a portal. But I never thought about it as being something that is regulating regular everyday reality.
Well, you know, one of the hallmarks of the DMT effect is that it feels more real than real.
Yeah.
And you study the function of endogenous neurotransmitters by giving, you know, drugs that modify the effect of that endogenous neurotransmitter. You know, so we've got the SSRI antidepressants, and they affect serotonin, although they may not all that much. But still, that's been the working model for decades. And you know, so you know, because SRIs are useful for depression and anxiety, you then can speculate that serotonin is responsible for mood or anxiety. So the hallmark of the DMT effect is it's more real than real. It feels more real than anything else. So it's tempting to speculate.
But that, again, when I go back to that disembodied mind thought process of like thinking, like, what am I thinking when I'm over there? Since my body doesn't seem to be there and I'm there, and it seems more real than real. Is that me just tricking myself into thinking that it's a different place?
I mean, how could you tell?
How could I tell, right?
Yeah, I mean, how would you know?
I have one way of looking at it that I always describe. This is what I say to people. I say, if there was a thing that you could do, like a door you could go through, and that door would take you to another dimension where you would communicate with some entity beyond your wildest imagination that's constantly visually changing and communicating with you telepathically and knows everything about you, sees all your bullshit, and is trying to impart some ideas that will help you with your life, because it's a godlike experience. Like you're experiencing like some sort of uber powerful entity, some or uber intelligent entity, something beyond any. If we just looked at humans and thought of the evolution of human, one day we'll get to this. We're not going to get to that. That is a different. It seems like it's so beyond the body. It's so beyond the human monkey body. This is what I tell people. I go, if you would open a door and you would go there and you'd have that experience, would you do it? And most people are like, yes, I would do it. If I gave you a drug that gave you that experience, you still have the exact same experience. It's the exact same experience. You've just decided it's not real. And you've decided it's not real because you're putting it in this category of hallucination. Like, what does that even mean? What does that even mean? You're actually having that experience. I don't know what it is. I mean, I like to play devil's advocate, and I like to think that maybe I'm messing with my own head, and maybe I'm just like, it's like
through doing what?
Looking at it like maybe it's just my neurochemistry going bonkers and interacting with my visual cortex could produces hallucinations.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't feel that way. That's why I'm trying to figure out if you're bullshitting yourself when you're over there or if you really are over there. But what I tell people is it's the same experience.
Yeah. What difference does it make?
What? Yeah.
Yeah. It's, previously invisible.
Yeah.
And it contains information.
A lot.
Yeah. And I think that's all you can say about it.
It contains information about you, right?
Well, it could only be happening to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not happening to somebody else.
It's like it gives you advice.
It can. But I mean, how do you judge the value of that advice?
Yeah. Well, what is the advice? One of the things that happened to me, I've talked about this ad nauseum, unfortunately, if you've heard this before, folks. But one of my experiences, there was like a bunch of jokers, like jesters, with like jester hats, and they were giving me the finger. They were going like this, "Fuck you," and it made me realize I was taking myself too seriously. Like instantaneously, I went, "Oh, I get it," and they went like this. They went like, "Don't do that, don't do that." But like saying "fuck you" to me, it was so clear what they were doing. It was so clear. It was like a little lesson. Like, don't do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Don't do that. That's like 3 syllables, and they correspond to a heartbeat. When I tripped on DMT the first time, these beings came out of this waterfall and they said, "Now do you see? Now do you see? Now do you see?" It was the same 3-beat thing.
I love you. They say I love you a lot.
I love you. And I think it corresponds to the heartbeat because it's in sync. The vocalizations is in sync with the heartbeat.
I love you. Yeah.
Bum, 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 bum.
The one time I did it, and these entities were
Morning,
talking to
Keely,
me,
love.
saying, "I
I'd
love
Marsh, big up, lad.
you 600,500,000 times," like the way a child would say "I love you" with like some crazy number, 7 billion zillions, like, and every time they did that, it would show a more beautiful image. Like every image, like "I love you 600,500,000 times." "I love you 700 zillion 400," and every time they did it, it was just this bigger and bigger experience visually, to the point where I was like crying. I was like openly weeping.
Oh yeah,
at the beauty of just what I was seeing.
It sounds beautiful.
It was wild, but it was that simple sort of. There's just like they'll say simple things to you in a way that you're not really hearing it, but you know what they're saying.
Well, it kind of penetrates you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very weird.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's very weird.
Very weird.
Yeah.
You used to not talk about your personal experiences with it.
I know. I figured to hell with it.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's good that you did that, because I remember when we first met, you were reluctant to discuss it. I mean, you didn't really want to talk about it publicly or want people to know about it publicly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I figured that I had some legitimacy to maintain. A few years back, I had this conversation with Dennis McKenna, like about your reputation or one's reputation. He said, "I've just given up on my reputation. It just, so."
Well, when you talk as openly about psychedelics as Dennis, he's the best guy to talk about it too, because he's got a really interesting way of discussing things, and he's had so many personal experiences, and he's so smart. And he's got this incredible vocabulary to just draw from. And when he describes the actual impact of psilocybin and psychedelic chemicals, particularly in formation of language, he was describing the stoned ape theory.
The stoned ape, yeah.
It's incredible listening to him say it, because the way he describes it, like he actually understands what psilocybin and what all these various molecules are doing to different parts of the brain, and why that would facilitate the development of language and compassion and connect the tribe more.
Well, I mean, do you think it actually is information coming from the brain, or do you think that the portal's being opened up and the information's coming from above?
I think that's more likely. I think the more likely is that the brain is an antenna. It's one of the things that creative people will always tell you. Like, someone sits down and writes a song, it just like came from the air. They're getting things from somewhere else almost, and it's almost like you just got to get out of your own way. You got to put enough good juice out there in the world and take enough bad out, and then just see the world from a clear perspective, at least in these brief moments of creativity, and then things come to them. They just like they're sitting in front of the computer and bam, they got an idea for a book. Like, where the fuck is all that coming from? It seems like people always want to say it's a muse. Like, that's the Stephen Pressfield analogy. He's got a great book about it called The War of Art, all about like inviting the muse into your life and being disciplined and sitting there at the computer every day and summoning it and treating it like it's an entity. And if you do that, it works. Like, this is what's crazy. Like, people who are disciplined and also creative, like, that decide, I'm going to write this book, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to force myself every day. Like, ideas come to them. Like, where the fuck are they coming from? Like, is it possible that the brain really is like some sort of an antenna, and that wisdom and love and all these different things, they're just all around us? We're just confused by our monkey bodies.
Well, do you think we're getting that information from God?
If that's what you want to call it, the only problem I have with the word God, and it's not really a problem, but it's a recognition, is that it's a loaded word.
It's a loaded word, but so is love.
Yes. Yes.
So I think you just got to take the good with the bad.
Well, that's Alex Gray's position. Alex Gray says we have to take it back the same way we take back love and say God all the time. And, that's what he does.
Yeah. And that's the reason I think it's good to use the word psychedelic instead of hallucinogen or
I think so too.
Entheogen or anything like that.
Entheogen's a cool word.
It's cool. It assumes a lot, though.
Yeah, it's like people that call weed cannabis.
Yeah.
I like to smoke a lot of cannabis. Like, okay, settle down, buddy.
Yeah, like the term entheogen, it refers to God, theos, and it refers to en, which means that God exists within.
Mm-hmm.
And it has the word gen in it, which means it's a drug which is generating something like God. So that assumes a lot. And there are people who could benefit from psychedelic experiences who might not cotton to those ideas and would avoid an entheogen, but might take a psychedelic.
Yeah, I think psychedelic sounds manageable. Entheogen sounds like you join a cult.
It's a bit cultish.
Well, isn't everything a bit cultish? It seems like whenever anything, really affects people in a lot of ways, there's always someone who looks to sort of take the reins and sort of dictate what the experience is and how to do it and what the ritual should be and how you should, manage it. And it gets culty.
It gets culty, but I think you could, decultify it
Yes.
to some extent.
Yeah, well, I don't think any experiments have been done yet on like collective family experience of psychedelic transformation, for example. We haven't got that far in the scientific analysis of such things.
It's worth attempting to do that, because I think that would again be a significant step toward creating this new paradigm around death, that medicine, that's a big deficit in medicine, this idea that death is inevitable, but death doesn't have to be terrible.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in and watching and listening. I'm very pleased today to have with me Dr. Dennis McKenna. He's an American ethnopharmacologist, lecturer, and author. He is a founding board member and director of ethnopharmacology at Hefter Research Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the use and exploration of psychedelic medicines. Dr. McKenna received his PhD from the University of British Columbia and worked as a postdoc at the National Institute of Mental Health and at Stanford. He is the brother of Terence McKenna, who believed that the human relationship with psychedelic plants played a major role in our cognitive and social evolution. He was a very well-known figure to denizens of the modern psychedelic movement. Dr. McKenna and I first met some years ago, 2016, in Toronto at a conference hosted by Mind Matters at the University of Toronto, where we shared our views on the potential significance of altered states of consciousness. It's really good to see you again, Dennis. Thanks very much for agreeing to do this podcast.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peterson. It's a pleasure to be invited. I'm very happy to be here. It's nice to see you again after 8 years. So neither you nor I were famous at that time. Now you're quite famous and I'm a little more well-known. So time passes.
Yeah, well, it's very good to see you. So tell me what you're up to recently. As you said, we haven't spoken for a number of years. So what are you busy doing now?
Well, basically, so I immigrated to Canada in 2019. And I left academia. I left the University of Minnesota, immigrated up here with my wife, and I started a nonprofit called the McKenna Academy for Natural Philosophy. And originally it was incorporated here in Canada, but then we dissolved that and incorporated in the States because it made more sense. And the McKenna Academy for Natural Philosophy is basically devoted to education, as you can tell by the name, primarily about psychedelics and plant medicines. Originally, our vision for it was to do retreats and conferences and that sort of thing. But in 2020, COVID came along and kind of put a spike in that. So the last actual physical conference we did before COVID was in 2019 in South America. We did a mystery school retreat with my friend Alexandre Tanu, who is a ethnomusicologist. There's that ethno term again. And then we did a lot of online events. We offered a 6-week-long ethnobotany course in collaboration with the Organization for Tropical Studies. In this year, we did our first physical conference since COVID in the UK. That was called ESPD 55, which is ESPD stands for the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. And 55 it was the 55th anniversary of the original conference, which was sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health in 1967. And I actually did an ESPD 50 in 2017, but that was before the McKenna Academy was formed. So we did these two, and people can look at espd55.com. It's open access, and see what we talked about. It was very well received. It was at this beautiful venue in Yorkshire, and in Dorset, I guess it was. And it was very well received, and we had 37 speakers covering a whole range of topics related to this general topic of the ethnopharmacologic search for psychoactive drugs. So that's what I've been doing, Jordan, basically working through the academy and doing that sort of thing.
Big government continues to spend borrowed money, inflation continues to swell, dragging down our economy, and the stock market has entered bear territory. So what's your plan? Are your assets diversified? I'm Philip Patrick, precious metals specialist.
Maybe we could let everybody watching and listening know a little bit more about what ethnobotany is exactly.
Sure.
So could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, ethnopharmacology is how I like to term it. So ethnopharmacology has a kind of formal definition if you want to get down in the weeds with it. But I kind of like the formal definition for a couple of reasons. Ethnopharmacology is the interdisciplinary scientific investigation of biologically active substances used or observed by humans in traditional societies. So it's a kind of a, you might say, tortured definition, but there's a reason for that. For one thing, its study is not confined to plants. It includes fungi and anything that may have biologically active substances. It's not necessarily about medicines. For example, arrow poisons are certainly within the purview of the study of ethnopharmacology, or any kind of biologically active substances, fish poisons, this kind of thing would be subjects for ethnopharmacology. But usually it's medicinal plants and not necessarily psychoactive. And it also, it's important to note that this is really about indigenous societies, not what we call developed societies, developed nations, or whatever. Because if it was under that definition, everything would be ethnopharmacology. The two terms, ethno is people and pharmacology is pharmacology, the study of drugs and their actions. But so this sort of elaborate definition kind of ticks all the boxes, if you will. It's interdisciplinary, it's biologically active substances, it's indigenous use of these things. And indigenous people, as we know, are very ingenious about discovering these things in the biome and utilizing them for medicines or poisons, food, or whatever.
Right. So you're one of a number of researchers who's going out to, let's say, pre-scientific locales or peoples and finding out what they know traditionally before their culture is lost, so that we can pull that knowledge into the broader scientific domain and associate it with what we already know, and also preserve it and hopefully extend it if we're fortunate.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And much of what the McKenna Academy does and that we're about is collecting and preserving this knowledge, this indigenous knowledge that is in danger of being lost, that's rapidly being lost due to all sorts of factors, the decimation of cultural traditions, the loss of habitat, the loss of species, climate change. All of these things are leading to the disappearance of this knowledge. And yet there is still a lot left to be known. So the McKenna Academy is trying to make a bridge between traditional knowledge, preserve it, and scientific investigation. Science is the nexus that brings these things together. And we have, we have done various seminars about this, like ESPD 50. We currently have a big project going in Peru, for which we're seeking support, which is to the university in Iquitos, Peru, UNAP. I've worked with the scientists there for over 50 years. And there's one person there that I've worked with since we were both graduate students. And I first came to Peru in 1981 to do my graduate work. I met this gentleman who was also a student at the time, and we have worked together over 50 years on various projects. He's now the curator of the herbarium at UNAP, at this university, the Herbario Amazonense. And we have a project going to digitize this herbarium and put it all online and make that a resource for scientific researchers or anyone with an interest in the Amazonian flora. This will be a tremendous repository of information about the plants, that have been collected and deposited in this herbarium over really for about 40 or 50 years. It really was established around 1970. I didn't get to Peru until 1981. But that's a big project that's our main focus now that ESPD 50 or ESPD 55 is more or less behind us. We're working on this other more ambitious project.
Now, you spent some time studying ayahuasca.
Yes.
And that's kind of an interesting story. So maybe you could tell everybody who's watching and listening how ayahuasca is prepared, and also how unlikely it was that preparation method was discovered. And I'd like to know if you have any more insight into how in the world that ever came about.
Yes to both. So I did my PhD research at the University of British Columbia was basically about ayahuasca, about looking at the chemistry, pharmacology, botanical sources, traditional uses of ayahuasca. Another aspect of my thesis research was kind of a comparison of ayahuasca with another much more obscure Amazonian psychedelic called ukuhe, which comes from entirely different botanical sources. But like ayahuasca, it is also an orally active form of dimethyltryptamine, and that's the key to this. DMT is a short-acting psychedelic, but it's not orally active by itself. If you consume DMT, if you drink a tea that contains DMT, or just eat DMT or whatever, it's not active because there are enzymes in the gut, monoamine oxidases, that will inactivate DMT before it's ever absorbed in the active form. What indigenous people have done when they prepare ayahuasca, they combine it with another plant that contains monoamine oxidase inhibitors, this class of compounds called beta-carbolines, very potent, very selective MAO inhibitors. So if you make a beverage, a drink, or decoction is really the technical term, with a plant that contains DMT and a plant that contains these beta-carbolines, then it becomes orally active. And instead of a 10 to 20 minute experience, which is what you get when you smoke DMT or vape DMT, they do that now these days, or inject it even, you get about 20 to 30 minutes of an experience. But in the oral form, it stretches it out to 6 or 7 hours. So it's a very different experience. It's not as intense but in some way it's deeper, it's more profound, because the thing with taking DMT by a parenteral route, other than through the gut, it is profound, it's very intense, it's also so fast that by the time you're, by the time you're just beginning to sort of get to the place, it's already fading. So you come back with not a lot of information, a kind of a sense of astonishment, but not a lot of hard data. So the idea of ayahuasca is you get to spend more time in that place, in that altered state, and there's a chance to learn more. Now, how did this come about? The question always comes up. How did these indigenous people figure out this combination? One plant containing beta-carbolines and another containing DMT. Out of the 80,000 or so species in the Amazon, how did they stumble on this one combination? Was it trial and error, or how? If you talk to the people, they will say, well, the plants told us, but to a Western scientist, this doesn't make a lot of sense. The plants told you? What are you talking about? Actually, I think the real story is a little more prosaic, in a sense that in our ESPD 50 conference, we had an anthropologist, Dr. Manolo Torres, who presented on this. And the fact is that at a certain point, maybe 1,000 years ago, possibly a little earlier than that, there was a very active, there were different cultures that were living sort of in proximity to each other in the region where Colombia, Venezuela, and Peru now come together. These cultures were very experimentally oriented toward plants. They had shamanic traditions, and they used, they were also very active in making chicha. They were essentially beer producers. They distilled, or they didn't distill them, but they had different fermented beverages prepared from fruits and grains and things like that. And they had many different kind of chicha, mostly prepared from manioc. And they were also experimentalists. They were like craft brewers today, sort of. Craft brewers they have their beer, but then they'll just reach for anything on the shelf, or an ingredient will come up and they'll say, oh, let's make a craft brew with kava in it, or with some other plant. Let's make something interesting. Well, the people making the chicha had the same sort of curiosity. And in their medicinal pharmacopoeia, they had the snuffs, right? That's the other way in the Amazon that the DMT is used, in the form of snuff. And they had these snuffs. They had these antidanthero snuffs, which don't require MAO inhibitors because you take them, as a snuff. They also had Banisteriopsis, which is the vine that contains the beta-carbolines. They use that separately as a medicinal plant for various reasons, and it has some psychoactivity. Basically, I think they stumbled on this formulation. The plants were in the mix, as it were, and they stumbled on this formulation, but it wasn't entirely trial and error. It was more like an educated guess, not really from the standpoint of biochemistry. They didn't think in terms of monoamine oxidase inhibition and that sort of thing, but they were familiar with the effects of these different plants, and they thought, well, what happens if we mix them? And they did. They had a spectacular result.
Designed for anyone to sell anywhere, Shopify gives entrepreneurs the resources once reserved for big businesses. An all-in.
Talking to Brian Murarescu, I think it's probably more than a year ago. He wrote The Immortality Key, and he was although a lawyer, the book is about ethnopharmacology in many regards, and it sounds to me like the account that you're making of what happened in the Amazon jungle sounds to me very much like what seemed to happen in ancient Greek culture with their formulation of various psychedelic wines.
That's right.
And so all these different people were just brewing all these different concoctions and experimenting to see what produced the most remarkable effect. And in Greece, they seem to have stumbled across something that was perhaps LSD based, or essentially LSD based, whereas in the Amazon jungle, they came across both DMT and the chemical that inhibited its breakdown. And so it's very interesting to see that is likely the case in both those disparate cultures.
Right. Well, shamanism, which is what we're talking about here, shamans are experimentalists, and many of our even most important medicines. Again, we can point to arrow poisons. I mentioned arrow poisons before, and arrow poisons are not regarded as medicines in the context in which they're used. They're used as poisons for hunting. On the other hand, the ingredients in arrow poisons do have medicinal properties that have been recognized in the 20th century, and they're important. They're important medicines for muscular surgery and this sort of thing. They block the neuromuscular junction. And the reason I mention arrow poisons is that's another example of people what I like to characterize as mucking around with plants. Throw things together and see what happens. And that's true of the psychoactive plants and these different chicha formulations that they have, or the arrow poisons, which are not just one ingredient. They're complex mixtures of many kinds of psychoactive or more or less toxic plants. So it was curiosity driven, the people immersed in this Amazonian biome, this chemical ecology, if you will, of complex secondary plant products and driven by curiosity. What happens if we take plant A and plant B and combine them, or plant A, B, C, and D and mix them all together, and what happens? So in that sense, their approach is very scientific, because science, really, discovery is driven by curiosity. These folks were curious. They didn't keep notes. They didn't write lab reports. What knowledge that they had, they transmitted through the culture, through oral traditions. And as this knowledge became, more widely disseminated, other groups began to also take the core knowledge, but then expand on it, because they had species, in their biomes that maybe not were originally around. And that's the way I think folk knowledge works. It's an evolutionary process. It's a process of sharing information and accumulating this knowledge that then is transmitted through oral traditions and through migrations and this sort of thing. So it's not formal science, but sort of the impulse that leads to this is curiosity, discovery, and that is at the core of science, in my opinion.
So I want to tie a couple of things together here. I recently talked with Dr. Carl Friston, who works at University College in London, and he's formulated a theory of cognitive function that's very influential, or elaborated a theory of cognitive function that's very influential. And I want to run it by you because I think it's relevant it's definitely relevant perhaps to your interests in the effects of psychedelics. So Friston and other observers have posited that we look at the world through a hierarchy of concepts, and that this is necessary, and that AI systems do the same thing, and that the hierarchically nested concepts range from those that are trivial, that you would just use in a throwaway manner, let's say. Maybe your opinion about what you're going to do in the next 10 minutes might fall into that category, to those that are the profound axioms upon which you predicate your life. So, for example, if you're married, one of your axiomatic conceptions or presumptions or even perceptions might be the faithfulness of your partner and the willingness of that person and you to continue to engage in your long-term relationship. And then then imagine a hierarchy of presumptions such that some presumptions are much more fundamental than others, or in other words, upon some presumptions, many other presumptions depend. And then for some other presumptions, like I said, they're just the opinion of the moment and easily replaceable. Now then imagine that there's a gradient of information processing, so that some neurological mechanisms process the relatively trivial conceptions and others process the more profound and deeper presumptions. And then imagine that's laid across the hemispheres, so that the left hemisphere more or less deals with the particulars and the right hemisphere deals with the more fundamental presumptions. And then imagine further, and this has been reasonably well documented now, that variants of serotonin affect different levels of that hierarchy of conception, so that the serotonergic systems that are affected by psychedelics affect the deep presumptions, and the serotonin mechanisms that are affected by antidepressants stabilize the entire structure. And so what Friston's work, along with Carhart-Harris, is indicating, there is others working on this as well, that psychedelics induce entropy into the conceptual hierarchy at the most fundamental level. And maybe that's associated, the hemispheric specialization element is something that I added to that net set of presuppositions, partly because of investigations I've done into hemispheric specialization, but also because of the work of Ian McGilchrist, who's been positing such things. And so it looks like the psychedelics affect systems that are naturally affected by high levels of stress, because when you're extremely stressed, maybe that's a time to revisit some of your fundamental presumptions, because something has gone wrong in your life so that you're fundamentally stressed. And so in some sense, what the psychedelics seem to do is mimic the process of revolutionary cognitive adaptation. Okay, so that's only half the question. But then I have another question, though, and that all strikes me as highly plausible, except for one thing. And this is a stumbling block for me, and maybe you can shed some light on it. I know this is a complicated question, but I read Rick Strassman's book, The Spirit Molecule, after meeting you, I believe. And I know Dr. Strassman, who's a pretty, let's say, mainstream psychiatrist, was quite shocked, to put it mildly, by what his research subjects were reporting as a consequence of being administered DMT. They would report being shot out of their body and then going to other places and encountering what were essentially alien beings of one form or another. And when Strassman would suggest to such people that this was like a dream, or maybe they were encountering something akin to a Jungian archetype, they would say, no, you don't understand. This was more real than being there, than being in reality itself. And so this is the thing that doesn't fit for me, is that, and I know that in the shamanic rituals that are associated with ayahuasca, people often report encounters with entities. And I don't understand how that, if that's true, and I believe it to be true phenomenologically, I don't understand how that fits in with the idea that what the psychedelics are doing are loosening the constraints on our most fundamental presuppositions. And so, sorry for the tremendously long build up to that question, but it's a complicated question. And I'm wondering what you think about, well, first of all, the theory that psychedelics do loosen up our conceptions at the most fundamental level, but then how you square that with the reports that people make continually of meeting entities of one form or another while they're under the influence of these chemicals.
Right. Well, how long have we got here? I mean, it's going to take a while to unpack this.
Good.
But,
I'm looking forward to it, man.
As to the first part of this, the Carhart-Harris notion that psychedelics, I think one way they put it is that they disable temporarily this so-called default mode network, you know, which is kind of the framework that we construct. I like to call it the reality hallucination. It's the model that the brain creates, a model reality that we inhabit. You know, we don't inhabit reality itself because it would be too overwhelming. What we experience is a schematic or a model of reality that is much less information dense than reality itself. And the brain does this in order so that we can cope with it. You know, a lot of what the brain does, as you well know, you're a neuroscientist, at least to some degree, you know that what the brain does is filter information out. There are gating mechanisms. A lot of information from the external world through our sensory neural interface never makes it into the brain because it's not that it's not important. It's just extraneous to our construction of this model of reality that we have to inhabit just in order to navigate, you know, in order to function. And what psychedelics do is they temporarily disable those gating mechanisms. They just throw the gates wide open, you know, and you get flooded with all this information that normally is not accessible. And that can be a very useful thing from a therapeutic angle because we can get trapped in our default mode network, in our reality hallucination, if you will, our reality model. It can be dysfunctional. It can be not helpful, you know, and then you get things like addiction and PTSD and so on. And I think the core of the therapeutic use of the therapeutic promise, if you will, of psychedelics is they let you step out of this reference frame temporarily. Look at it as though, you know, as though you're separated. And it helps give you insights as to, you know, your existential situation. So it enables you to look at trauma or addiction or depression or things like that from a different angle, from a different perspective that normally we can't because we're trapped inside this default mode network framework. And I think that's helpful, and I think that lets you re-engineer it in a certain way. And this is actually reflected on the neurological level because we know that psilocybin, things like this can actually lead to changes in neural architecture and connectivity and all of these things. Neuroplasticity is the sort of overarching term for this. And it's really, so you blow up the default mode network, but the brain is resilient. The brain is always going to tend toward equilibrium, right? So it's going to fall back together, but it's going to fall back together in a more functional way. I think it's very similar. In fact, I think it's quite similar to what happens when you reboot your computer. You get this big reset, essentially. and it comes back together, but it works more efficiently because you purged all the kludge out of it that builds up in this system. And in that sense, it's very much like sort of purging your computer. When you reset it, you get rid of all that stuff, and it works more efficiently. So that's important, I think, for the therapeutic. That's really the therapeutic promise. Almost everything that psychedelics, that people are excited about psychedelics from a therapeutic standpoint, I think has to do with this ability to, first of all, disable and then reconstruct the default mode network in a way that's more functional and simply in a way that's more functional, less dysfunctional. So I think that's what's going on. Now, when you blow it up, especially with something like DMT, which is where you get more than other places, but ayahuasca, these other things as well, you sometimes have a feeling or you get a definite sense that you're in a place where, as people say, it seems more real than real. And there are entities there, or what's perceived to be entities. And you're in communication with them. And they are very interested in communicating and transmitting information. So a number of questions come up about this, right? People have these experiences, not always on all psychedelics, not every time, but under some circumstances, people have these experiences. I just came from this conference in the UK a couple of weeks ago, so I'm well primed for this because this was the topic of the conference. It was called The Sentient Other, and everyone was presenting their ideas about the entities. My first, I don't think you can take psychedelics and not be open-minded. I think that one thing that psychedelics do teach us is how little we know. It's a useful reminder of how little we know about the universe, about reality, about the way things are. And in that sense, it can be very useful because science, especially, and scientists particularly, tend to be arrogant. There's a tendency for science to say, we pretty much have this thing figured out, and psychedelics are a reminder that no, actually, we have only a very tiny slice of it figured out. And even that is subject to question because that's the nature of science, right? You never prove a theory. All you can do is not disprove it. So we understand in great detail a very small piece of reality. But there's an infinitude of reality beyond that we know basically nothing. So we need science and scientists should be humble. They should always keep that in mind, how little we know. That said, though, so with that preamble, I do have to say, reductionism or skepticism, or what they sometimes call Occam's razor approach, the principle of parsimony, is a useful tool in science because it is a statement that what explains the data, the simplest model that explains the data, let's start there. And then its shortcomings, its limitations, its deficiencies will come to light as we begin to investigate phenomena. And eventually we're going to, but science starts with hypotheses about the way things are. what my granddad used to call how the boar ate the cabbage, you know. It begins with theories about the way a certain aspect of reality is. You create a hypothesis, you test it against the observed data, and if something comes up that the data, you know, that your model can't explain, then you say, okay, the model is deficient. We either have to modify the model, maybe we have to blow up the model, maybe it's completely invalid. Usually that's not the way it works. I mean, you tweak it, you change, you know, a thing here, a thing there, and you make it fit better with what, you know, what we presume that we know, right? When it comes to entities, here's the thing. I know that people say, oh no, this is real. This is more real than reality itself. But, you know, people are not epistemologists. People are not qualified to say what is more real than reality itself. You know, I mean, people may think it's more real. It may seem more real than reality itself. You know, we've all had vivid dreams, right? And we wake up and we think, oh my God, you know, that was so real. But you know it was a dream, right? Because you woke up and it's not there. And so I think that the judgments made by people who encounter these entities, you know, the fact that they have this impression that these things are real and more real than real itself does not necessarily make it so.
Okay, so let me ask you this. So obviously, when we dream, as you pointed out, we can encounter entities of our imagination. Those are other dream characters. Now,
Right.
I had a client once who was a lucid dreamer, and a very good one.
Right.
And she could actually ask her dream characters what they represented symbolically, and
Right.
they would tell her.
Right.
And so, okay, so let me modify the question that I posed to you before and tell me what you think of this. So we know that the psychedelics produce an increment in trait openness. And we know with the psilocybin in particular, that if people have a mystical experience with psilocybin once or a couple of times, that their level of trait openness, which is the creativity dimension, increases by one standard deviation, and that appears more or less permanent. So we could say that one of the things the psychedelics do by loosening the strictures on the more fundamental realms of conception is place people into a state that's analogous to the state of creativity. And so if you're creative, you can shift conceptions, and the downside of that is you shift them when it's not necessary, and the upside is now and then you shift them in a direction that's extremely productive. And so that shifting becomes more possible under the influence of psychedelics. And then we could say that, well, it's possible that one of the sources of creativity might be the capacity of the human imagination to generate fictional personalities. We do that in dreams. Obviously, your brain is, we would say, your brain is producing these fictional characters that have many of the attributes of real characters. When you dream, you can see them, you can hear them, you can interact with them. You don't have immediate access to their contents of consciousness. They seem like autonomous beings. And so we could say, maybe what happens when you're experimenting with psychedelics is that you enter a dreamscape that's populated by creatures of the imagination that have a certain degree of autonomy, and the influx of information that's also characteristic of the psychedelic experience produces that sense of hyper-reality that's then attributed to the characters themselves. Does that seem plausible? I know it's just a hypothesis, obviously, but it is the
it does. I mean, obviously, all we're doing is trying to construct hypotheses, you know, that fit the data, that fit what we know so far, always with the caveat that we don't know much and the picture is incomplete and so on. But here's the thing. I think, I mean, the question perpetually that comes up with these entities is you encounter these entities in the psychedelic state, and then the question is, are they real? But I think you have to step back from that. And first of all, you have to say, well, what do you mean by real?
Well, yeah, that's a problem, man. Yeah. That's a big problem.
My sort of default position is anything that you experience is real. It's real because it can be experienced, but is it originate within? Is it come from the collective unconscious? Does it come from out there in some other dimension? And do these terms even make sense? I mean, you just get into an epistemological mess, because how can you even posit there is an outside? I mean, one thing that psychedelics do is they teach you it's all one. There's no separation between the self and the cosmos at large and all that. So it's like it's a non-starter. It's a zero-sum game to maybe it's more useful to say rather than to say, are they real? Because they're real enough that they're experienced. So in that sense, they're real. Whether they're inside or outside, originate from the self or some other dimension. Maybe the question we should ask is the information that they transmit useful? Can we learn from it? Can it teach us something that we could not otherwise know? And that seems to me potentially a more useful question. And my brother was all about this. Like he would take high doses of mushrooms, by himself, and in total darkness. That was his formula. Heroic doses in total darkness, and he would have these dialogues, these conversations with these entities, and it was all about, how do I know you're real? Or more like, can you tell me something that I cannot possibly know? And if you do that, I'll know you're real. And they would say, well, we don't care if you think we're real or not, But and then again, how do you define something that you can't possibly know? And if they say, you can say, give me, the square root of a large number, and if it comes back and it turns out it's correct, as trivial as that is, that would demonstrate that it was real information they're giving to you, but it still doesn't really.
No, and there are mathematical geniuses who can do that.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so let me push on that a little bit. Everything that you said so far seems to me to be rock solid. So with regards to these entities again, I was reminded of two things. Carl Jung spent years talking to entities of his imagination, documenting that in books like the Red Book. He made that a visionary practice and had illuminating conversations with specters of his own imagination. But of course, he also believed that there was a collective element to those. And so you might say that, well, to the degree, for example, that we're each inhabited by dark impulses, we might say, well, we're each prey to the same demonic forces. That's one way of thinking about it. And they're the same, and they're transpersonal, and they exist to some degree cross-culturally, and they span time. And so these creatures of imagination can have histories and can inhabit us in some real sense, and they can do that collectively. And then, so that complicates things tremendously. But then I would also ask, in your investigations, your long-term investigations of multiple ayahuasca experiences across different people, are there any commonalities of entities that strike you as particularly significant? I know people talk about clown figures, for example, mechanical clowns in the DMT state, and
elf machines and this sort
elves.
of thing.
Yeah, exactly. The elf machines. And of course, that's complicated too, because once one person starts talking about it, that might increase the probability that other people would experience it. But have you seen commonalities of entity experience that would suggest something, the existence of something that is at least transpersonal, even though it might also still be subjective, whatever that means in such a context?
Yes, I have, and I think this exists in these shamanic traditions, and the ayahuasca is a particularly good example of that. And again, I have not seen anything that convinces me. I mean, I'm basically a Jungian, so I believe in the collective unconscious as this, it's a good model, this transpersonal realm of shared archetypes and all that. And then there's the individual unconscious. I haven't seen anything in the reports of the psychonauts that would not fit into that model, that says, oh, well, this doesn't really fit. This is outside that model. And so that model's not valid. I haven't seen that. I think that it is. I think basically these entities, they are experienced as real, but they come from the collective unconscious. And if you look at the ayahuasca traditions, and there is an interesting book here that's very illustrative of this, which many people know about. It's the book that you're familiar with, the artist Pablo Amaringo, the visionary Peruvian artist. He and Luis Eduardo Luna wrote a book. He painted his visions, right? He remembered all his visions in perfect detail, painted these visions. And Eduardo and he collaborated on a book called Ayahuasca Visions, the religious iconography of a Peruvian shaman. It's still in print. The book is remarkable because it's its typical coffee table style format with full color illustrations of the visions on one page, and Eduardo's descriptions in English on the facing page, dissecting all the elements of the entities and everything else that you see in these visions, as narrated by Pablo. I mean, Pablo, Eduardo Luna was basically just the transcriber, but Pablo described in great detail, dissected each one of these paintings, and there are about, I guess, 20 or so of these paintings in this book. And it's basically a course in vegetalismo. It's talking about vegetalismo, this practice, which is really an amalgam of many indigenous traditions and kind of mushed together into a mestizo tradition. But he describes these entities, they all have names, they have a particular appearance, and the plants, the animals, even there are UFOs, there are all kinds of things in these visions. Pablo describes every one of them, and any ayahuasquero in training, apprenticing under Pablo or any of these traditional ayahuasqueros, they're gonna see these things. I mean, this is a cultural context. They're going to see these things, and what they see is going to be similar, So it's sort of like Terence's, self-transforming elf machines. I mean, Terence says that, he has a huge voice in the meme sphere. Pretty soon, everybody's seeing self-transforming elf machines. People. That's what people see.
Well, you could imagine, the brain is obviously an organ that can produce personalities, because it produces our personalities. And it seems to me that it's highly probable that the way that we we organize information is in the form of personality. So, I mean, and I certainly got a fair bit of this from thinking about Jung's work. I mean, if you're inhabited by a rage state, which I think is a good way of thinking about it, you might think, well, what form does the anger take? And the answer is, well, it has a personality. You might act like enraged people that you've seen in movies. You might act like enraged people that you've seen in your life. The rage has a goal, which is the crushing of the opponent, let's say, and it has perceptions and it has action patterns. It's a personality. And you could conceptualize the rage spirit as Ares, the god of war, and that would be a perfectly reasonable way of looking at it. And it could be that all of our micro perceptions and all of our macro perceptions, for that matter, have the intrinsic form of personality, and that's partly what we encounter when we dream. And so I was thinking too, you know, that as the gods, if the gods are aggregates of micro personalities, that might be one way of thinking about it. They're micro personalities that are aggregated within societies across time and then can be apprehended collectively to some degree. As you move towards a monotheistic vision of the world, what you're moving toward is the ultimate aggregation of all these socially modified micro-personalities into one conceptual scheme. And that would parallel that hierarchy that of cognition and conception that, well, we already discussed that people like Friston are working on. And so it isn't that surprising, I suppose, if you think about it that way, if the brain is a personality-producing machine, so to speak, that there are certain states that you can encounter under the influence of chemical alteration where you encounter those personalities, even those that have some degree of autonomy. I mean, rage has some degree of autonomy, and so does lust, and so does thirst, and so does hunger. They're not exactly you. They're forces or personalities, which is a more accurate way of thinking about it, that you can fall prey to. And so why can't that occur in a more complex manner?
Well, I think it can. I mean, this totally fits within the Jungian model, you know, that within the collective unconscious there are these I forget the exact term that he used, but these complexes, almost like autonomous personalities, you know, and multiple personality disorder is a recognized thing. And I guess in some ways, all of us have it in a certain sense, in that we have, you know, we do have these multiple personalities, but they, like rage, lust, and so on, but they don't take over the controls. You know, most of the time they're suppressed to a certain degree, but they're always there, and they're influencing whoever it is in the cabin, at the bridge that's running the thing. And in pathology, they can take over, you know, and then you've got a problem.
Well, they do with Tourette's syndrome. They do with Tourette's. They do with obsessive compulsive disorder.
Exactly.
And you can think about the relationship between these motivational states like rage or anxiety, let's say, that are transpersonal in that everyone experiences them. We know that with the psychedelic experience, that set is very important, and that if someone is in a negative emotional state or situation that elicits fear and, let's say, rage, and then they embark upon a psychedelic experience, that particular state can be magnified beyond belief. And so that's a good way to have a hellish experience. And so, you know, we do have to remember, and I know, of course, you do, that the psychedelic experiences that we're talking about are ritualized so that an absolutely dreadful outcome is less probable. But you might say if it was just done randomly, it could easily be the magnification of a state of terror or a state of rage as the magnification as a state of enlightenment or bliss.
Right. So this is the importance of the ritual context. This is exactly that. What these traditions have grown around is the idea that there needs to be an appropriate set and setting. There needs to be an appropriate set, the most important variable, certainly. And I sometimes say in my talks, I say ayahuasca is a liquid. Ayahuasca will fill any vessel you create for it, and hopefully the vessel is appropriate to, to foster a positive experience and insights and all that. But we know that it's not always that way. We know that, again, like with any spiritual tradition where you're finding, where you're dealing with powerful spiritual forces, there are always bad apples. There are bad shaman. There are bad shaman who's don't have your best interests at heart. And there's a term for it in ayahuasca. It's called brujeria. I mean, basically witches or sorcerers. They have this understanding. These people are power freaks. They want control over other people. And they'll often, use ayahuasca that way. They'll often, spike their ayahuasca with datura, with brugmansia, which is a drug that, basically renders people both delirious and confused, but also very suggestible. And it's used as a date rape drug and things like that. Some, bad shamans will put that stuff into ayahuasca. So you want to be careful. There is no there's no good housekeeping seal for ayahuasqueros. You want to be careful who you get mixed up with.
Right. Well, the same thing applies when you're looking for a psychotherapist. I mean, and in terms of the importance of SET in relationship to positive transformation, I mean, Carl Rogers tried to lay out some of the preconditions for successful psychotherapy. And so I'll just run through those because they're very much akin to the manner in which the stage needs to be set for a positive psychedelic experience. So Rogers, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but it's okay. So first of all, the person who's coming to psychotherapy has to want to change. It has to be voluntary. And that's actually something that's been hammered home by now generations of psychotherapeutic practitioners, regardless of their theoretical school, that voluntary exposure to information that might have a transformative quality, so that can be threatening, voluntary exposure is redemptive. It has to be voluntary. So you have to want to change. And then if you come to psychotherapy, for it to work, it has to be embarked on in a spirit of mutual trust. And so there's some courage there on both the part of the practitioner and the client. And then you also have to swear or vow in some sense to engage in truthful exploration and dialogue. And so you have to admit you have a problem. So there's a certain humility there. You have to be willing to learn and change. You have to engage in truthful exploration and dialogue, and you have to be aiming for improvement. And if all of those things are there, then, well, in principle, the psychotherapeutic process can begin. And you might say, well, if all those things are there, then learning itself can begin. And it might be that the set that is being established at the beginning of a psychedelic experience is just precisely akin to establishing the preconditions for learning and personality expansion itself. Because, in this conversation, you and I, well, look, we're sitting here, we're kind of relaxed, we trust each other for a variety of different reasons. We've met before, but I know of your reputation scientifically, and I trust your work, and so we can embark on a creative dialogue that's hypothetically mutually redemptive, because we're both going to learn something, and we can bring everyone else along for the ride. And I don't really see that as any different in some fundamental sense than establishing the proper set for a psychedelic experience or the proper preconditions for any relationship, including a therapeutic relationship.
Right. I think you're exactly right. I think those preconditions are an almost exact match for the ideal set and setting. I mean, there's a great deal of emphasis on the setting, the set. And I don't limit the set to just, in my mind, it's everything you bring to the table. It's not just your mood at the moment, or it's everything you bring to the table. It's you. You're the set. You're always the set, but you're bringing it to this very special situation. And then the other variables that are sort of in the background, not often mentioned, but very important, are the dose and the medicine, because that's part of this 4-part dynamic of variables that's going to interact. And the most important thing about a therapeutic psychedelic session, really, like you say, it applies to any therapeutic session. It's number one, a safe setting, a setting where you feel you trust the other person, you feel that the situation is safe, not threatening, and you're willing to learn. You're willing to surrender. You do everything you can to make sure everything's kosher. And then at the critical moment, you just have to let go, because that's an important thing. You have to say, okay, let go. It's kind of like jumping off a cliff or out of a plane. You trust that the parachute is going to open at some point, and you just have to accept that.
Yeah, well, we do that while we're talking, you and I. Because at the beginning of this podcast, neither of us knew what direction the conversation was going to take, but what we're doing in some sense is loosening up our cognitive structures. You and I both have some perspectives on what the psychedelic experience might consist of and what psychological transformation means, but we're willing to play with that to some degree. And so we're willing to open ourselves up to the transformative process that obtains during the course of what we try to make into a genuine dialogue. And so, I do see that as essentially exactly the same thing. And I think you can think about it in terms of classical virtue in some sense. So what you want to do is bring an attitude of humility and courageous trust to the situation. And the humility would be, good as I am, I probably still have a few things to learn. And the courageous trust is, if we undertake the process correctly, then the information that will be generated will actually be of benefit to everyone involved. But that's a statement of faith in some sense, right? Because you don't know that to begin with. But then it's faith in the dialogue, essentially. And I don't see that. I don't see that as being particularly different in the psychedelic situation.
No, I don't either.
It's exaggerated and intensified.
Exactly.
What have you made of the research that's being conducted in the labs by Roland Griffith and his crew?
Well, obviously it's groundbreaking, and Roland and his colleagues are, they have set the bar very high, and they're the pioneers for sure. And everyone else is kind of following along from that. I think that they have, particularly in their work with end-of-life anxiety and this sort of thing, I think that's setting new paradigms for medicine. And it's addressing a really important deficit in medicine, right? Because medicine, the way it's practiced, biomedicine, I sort of make a distinction there from, say, alternative complementary medicine. But biomedicine is about preventing people from dying, right? And they will go to great lengths to keep people alive, maybe to in certain cancer therapy and this sort of thing, maybe going too far to keep people alive. It's like survival at all costs. Medicine needs to face the fact that everybody dies. Sooner or later, the therapy is going to fail, no matter what it is. But to view it as a failure is an incorrect perception. At a certain point, you have to reach a point where you say, this patient, this person is not going to live. Rather than focus on keeping them alive at all costs, let's think about giving them a peaceful death, facilitating a beautiful death. That concept that death can be beautiful is something that is missing from medicine as it's practiced. And I think that psychedelics offer an opportunity to reintroduce that concept.
Right. So just to review for people who are listening, so Roland Griffiths, who conducts psilocybin research at Johns Hopkins and is a very solid scientist, to say the least, has produced studies showing that with patients who have a terminal prognosis of cancer, that a mystical experience induced by psilocybin can produce a profound reduction in mortality-related anxiety. And that's a very sterile way of describing what's actually a remarkable event, because it sounds in some sense like it's reduced to simple Occam's razor chemistry. You give people a dose of psilocybin and they're less anxious. It's like, that isn't what's happening. What's happening, and we don't know the details of what's happening. What's happening is that, imagine that one of the canonical fears that people bring to life existentially is fear of suffering and mortality. I mean, that and public humiliation and excommunication are probably the two big classes of fears. So we'll say fear of mortal suffering. And then a mystical experience undertaken under the appropriate circumstances can reduce the fear of mortal suffering itself under the most dire circumstances. And the dire circumstances would be when directly confronted with the inevitability of mortality and suffering. And so, but I haven't been able to gather much information on exactly how the transformation that's induced by the psychedelic substance actually makes itself manifest, because that has to be a very fundamental cognitive and perceptual retooling to be much more sanguine in the face of death itself. Very big things are shifting underneath the surface. And so, do you have any sense with your vast experience in such domains? Do you have any experience or any sense of what it is that shifts?
Yeah, I do. I think, again, it goes back to this, what we were talking about before, about stepping outside your cognitive reference frame, stepping outside your default mode framework, whatever that might be, giving you a chance to look at death as you might look at any problem that you have, anxiety or trauma or whatever. Look at it from a different perspective. And what has impressed me about the reports of people who have had this end-of-life therapy with psilocybin, what seems to be the therapeutic, what is most beneficial for them is they come away from the experience and they're not preoccupied with death anymore. They're not looking ahead to this moment of dying. They know it's out there, but their attitude is, well, wait a minute. I'm alive now. I'm alive at this moment.
I see.
Let's focus on that. Death is there. It will come. But I think that's tremendously helpful for them and anxiety relieving to say, let's just focus day to day on the moment, being alive in the moment. And that relieves their anxiety greatly. And it's interesting, that, we don't evaluate, like many cancer drugs, chemotherapy and that sort of thing, they're evaluated, their effectiveness is based on how long did they prolong life? Did they live longer than would be expected if they didn't take this chemotherapy? Often, many of these things do extend life, but by the time you finally die, you're a wreck. It destroys the body. And it's interesting that nobody is claiming that psilocybin cures cancer, but it certainly can extend life. beyond expectation. I mean, there's a woman up here that there's a movie out called Dosed 2, and I've been in this movie, part of it, called Dose 2, and she started out with terminal diagnosis of, I think it was colon cancer, liver cancer or something. She was told she would live about 6 months. That was 5 years ago. She's had 2 psilocybin sessions. You would never think of this person as being sick. They don't appear to be sick. Her attitude is good. And, she knows she's dying, but she doesn't live every moment anticipating that. She's more about, she's living in the moment. And it's beautiful to see, because her family life, her relationship with her husband, her friends and all that, that's what she's enjoying, and she's having a good time. Everybody knows she's going to die sooner or later. They've stopped predicting.
But then again, as you said, that's true of all of us to some degree.
Of course, yeah.
And the end can come at any moment, and to be preoccupied with that obviously can produce very counterproductive consequences. Well, so I just did a lecture series on the Sermon on the Mount for this Peterson Academy that we're putting together, online educational initiative. And I want to just run that by you for a second in relationship to what we just described. So as far as I can tell, the ethos in the Sermon on the Mount is quite straightforward. It's not party like there's no tomorrow, because the lilies of the field do not toil and do not spin. It's not a hippie ethos at all. It's certainly not tune in, turn on, and drop out. It's 2 parts. The first part is it's to love God with all your heart and soul. And that means to me, technically speaking, psychologically speaking, let's say, to do something like orient yourself as much as you possibly can to the highest good that you're capable of conceptualizing. And so, for example, when you're ensconced in a family and facing a mortal challenge, one of the higher goods that you might attend to is to make the most out of every moment that you have with the people that you love. And then once you're oriented in that direction, then to pay as much attention to the moment as possible, right? To let the day be sufficient. Let the troubles of the day be sufficient to the day. Say that. Sufficient unto the day are the troubles therein. It's an injunction to focus on the moment.
Listen up, guys. This is the important bit.
And then you might say, well, there's a tremendous amount of information in the moment, a tremendous amount of redemptive information. And the more you pay attention to the moment, the more you open yourself up to what's, in some sense, the infinite complexity of the moment. And so you might say, if you orient yourself properly, and that would be a matter of getting the set right at all times, not just when you're preparing for a psychedelic experience. If you get the set right and you open yourself up to the moment, then you can find all the meaning that you need to immerse yourself in life in that moment.
Exactly.
And that's dependent on the intensity of your attention. Yeah, well, that's okay. So that's very useful, that conceptualization. So your sense is that it turns the insights, the mystical insights, turn people away from the precipice of death to the infinite possibility of the moment.
Exactly.
That fear of death might be one of those screens, in some sense, that are blocking or inhibiting the flow of redemptive information. And so the psychedelic experience obliterates that and says, remember what's right in front of you.
Yeah. And the fear of death is, this is what the psychedelic experience helps diffuse, by refocusing on the moment. I am hopeful. I don't know if it will ever happen, but I think the next step in psilocybin or psychedelic therapy for the end of life, an interesting threshold could be crossed, if you will, if people would, if you could arrange this therapy so that the family members could also participate with the dying person. Can you imagine the dynamic that would engender? People to share this experience of the loved ones impending mortality for sure, but just the richness of the relationships, the ability that psychedelics give you some time to honestly relate to your loved ones, in a way that is unfiltered. And you know how hard it is sometimes for us to really express to someone our love, even though we love them, but sometimes the words "I love you" is a hard thing to say, and I think it would be very helpful for the family to be able to not only be present, but also be in the altered state with the people, and because it would be as healing for them as it is for the person who is dying.
Yeah, well, I've noticed that families who cope well with the impending death of someone that's central to the family often do that in no small part by paying increased attention to the remaining relationships. And so that as they lose one, they deepen the others, and sometimes, in some sense, as a consequence of that loss, right? And so that might be an analog to what you're describing. I guess the trick with a family would be to try to get the set of the entire family matched to the circumstance, because it is also the case that the stress that impending mortality can place a family within can also bring out the pathologies and divide people further. And so, but obviously that's a suboptimal situation.
It's worth exploring. It's tricky territory. And again, I think if we look to the indigenous model, as probably something we should look at as a way to approach this, because they often do exactly this kind of thing, but they're, very much more about the collective and all that. So, it's just an idea. I mean, it'd be interesting if it could happen,
Yeah, well, I don't think any experiments have been done yet on like collective family experience of psychedelic transformation, for example. We haven't got that far in the scientific analysis of such things.
Hard to get FDA approval for that, but it's worth attempting to do that, because I think that would again be a significant step toward creating this new paradigm around death. That medicine, that's a big deficit in medicine. And this idea that death is inevitable, but death doesn't have to be terrible. And so that's the frontier. Hopefully that can be explored.
So
To all my furry friends, that's all on DMT, ayahuasca, magic mushrooms, LSD. Do it every day, fuck your head right up. Disclaimers there on the screen. Don't do drugs. Drugs are bad, okay? But there's definitely some truth. Definitely some truth to an understanding that we haven't been taught, on a spiritual side of us, that these drugs seem to unlock. I'm Taff. You've been listening to Taffy 46. LSD stream. Thank you, everybody who's come along. Whoever listens to this. And I'm going to play out with a tune that everybody knows. Goes something like this.
Time was on my side when I was running down the street and for the fight. She gave her an old guitar and something you'd occupy my mind. Yes, she was born to be alive. Yes, she was born to be alive. People ask me why I never find a place to stop and settle down. But I never wanted all those things before me to justify the life. Yes, we were born to be alive. Yes, we were born. It's good to be alive, to be alive, to be alive. It's good to be alive, to be alive, to be alive. It's good to be alive. It's good to be alive, to be alive, to be alive. It's good to be alive. Time was on my side when I was running down the street and folks go bye. She was born to be alive. Born to be alive. Yeah, she was born yeah, she was born to be alive. Born to be alive. Yeah, she was born to be alive. Born to be alive. Born to be alive. Yes, she was born